on Bush, and Bush was culpable, no question about it. But, I mean, the Fed was more to blame. But Obama is saying, look, this is because of capitalism. There wasn't enough government. There was too much free market capitalism. There was too much greed, on Wall Street. And even George Bush admitted or said that Wall Street got drunk. And Obama somehow thought, well, yeah, they were drunk on capitalism. They weren't. They were drunk on cheap money. And what George Bush didn't understand and didn't bother to figure it out or ask himself the question, where did everybody on Wall Street get all this alcohol? How'd they get so drunk? And it wasn't just Wall Street that was drunk. The whole country was acting drunk. And the alcohol came from the Federal Reserve. And Greenspan was the bartender, and then Bernanke, that's what liquored everybody up. And that's why they acted so recklessly. It wasn't the free market. The free market would have given us a housing bubble. The free market would have prevented a housing bubble. All these loans couldn't have been originated in the free market. It was only because we had no free market. It was only because the government was artificially redirecting loans to places they never would have been made. Based on artificially low rates and government subsidies, the government funneled all this money into the housing market. That's what happened. And then it blew up. But what is Obama's solution? Did President Obama learn anything from the mistakes of George Bush? No. Did Ben Bernanke learn anything from the mistakes of Alan Greenspan? No. Because they're repeating every one. The only difference is they're making the same mistakes on a grander scale. Bush decided to run Keynesian-style deficits to try to artificially stimulate the economy. We're doing the same thing under Obama, except the deficits are 5 times as big. Instead of $300 billion, it's $1.5 trillion. Ben Bernanke, did he learn a lesson and say, gee, Alan Greenspan kept interest rates too low for too long? No. Ben Bernanke's solution was, I'm going to keep rates even lower for even longer. And now, you got to think, okay, the result of the monetary and fiscal stimulus under Bush and Greenspan was the housing bubble and the financial crisis, and we barely averted the biggest economic collapse since the Great Depression because of what that monetary and fiscal policy produced. When that stimulus wore off, that's how bad the hangover was. Now, instead of dealing with the problems, we decided to have more of that stimulus, only on a bigger scale. So think about this. It was so bad in 2008, based on 1% interest rates for a couple of years, or the Fed raising rates very slowly, because when the Fed started to raise rates, they did it too slowly. It was a quarter point every couple of months. So they brought it down to 1%, they raised it too slow, and we had $300 billion deficits, and we just narrowly avoided the Great Depression. Well, what is awaiting our future? Based on this, what is it going to look like when this stimulus wears off? What is the next crisis that our leaders are in the process of creating, and how bad is it going to be? Because we didn't avoid a repeat of the Great Depression. Right? We just postponed it and assured it. And in fact, it's not even going to be a repeat of the Great Depression. Because in hindsight, the Great Depression isn't going to look so great next to what we're going to go through. In fact, it might look closer to the Roaring '20s than the Great Depression. That's how bad it's going to be, because we refuse to deal with this problem. We continuously kick that can down the road, but the problem is when you're out of road, and the can is now enormous, right? What happens? Nothing. You've got to deal with that can, and that's where the next crisis is coming. And I even wrote about this in Crash Proof, because when I wrote Crash Proof, I forecast that the government would repeat these mistakes and try to artificially revive the economy after the housing bubble burst, much the way that it's done. And it was the crash that followed that crash that I was worried about in Crash Proof. It wasn't the first one. It was the next one, which is the one that's coming and which is the subject of the new book. So what is this crash going to look like? Well, the first bubble we had in this series of bubbles, we had a stock market bubble, Too much cheap money from the Fed went into the stock market. You saw the consequence there, all these crazy startups, and that bubble burst, and then the money went into the housing market. And you know, the Fed tries to claim that, well, we didn't cause the housing bubble because the housing bubble started, housing prices started to go up in 1996, right? So how could we have caused it in 2000? No. The reason that housing prices were going up back then was money was too cheap back then as well. And in fact, a lot of the money that was being made in the stock market bubble was used to buy real estate. So the real estate bubble really started before the stock market bubble burst. But the Fed created both the stock market bubble and the housing bubble because they were both a consequence of cheap money. It's just that the stock market bubble got bigger faster. It flamed out first. And when the stock market bubble burst, a lot of that speculation flowed into the yet-to-burst real estate bubble that only got a lot bigger based on all the fuel that the Fed threw on the real estate market after the stock market bubble burst. And maybe the Fed's intention was to try to revive the stock market, but what it really revived or threw gasoline on the flames from the housing bubble. So the second bubble was housing. All that cheap money went into real estate. Where is this bubble now? Where is all this cheap money that the Fed is creating going? What is the bubble that is being created right now? Well, I call it the government bubble. That's where it's going. The money is going to the government. The government is spending a tremendous amount of money. I mean, the government budget now is almost $4 trillion a year. It's an enormous amount of government spending. Where is it getting the money? From the Federal Reserve. In fact, the government's even cut taxes. They cut payroll taxes. Social Security now pays out more in benefits than it collects in taxes. I mean, where's all this money coming from? It's coming from the Fed. The Fed has enabled tax cuts and massive increases in government spending. You can see the bubble in the bond market. I mean, the number of outstanding Treasury bonds has exploded, yet the prices are still sky high. People are buying 10-year government bonds and accepting a coupon of 1.8. The inflation rate is twice that, even the inflation rate that the government admits to. Forget about what it actually is. Nobody would buy these bonds. I mean, this obviously is a bubble. Who's buying them? Central banks. Central banks all around the world, and in particular, the U.S. Central Bank. The Federal Reserve now has been buying, I think, 90% of all the long-term treasuries that are sold. Take the Fed out of the market, what happens to price? Price collapses. So this is a bubble of government spending based on debt that is only sustainable as long as interest rates stay low.